What's Hebrews chapter 11 about? See if anybody can remember.
Faith.
Faith. And how is it described? Okay, that's a definition. But what is the topic in Hebrews 11? Besides faith, who are the examples? The heroes of faith. Old Testament people found in the Old Testament who are examples of faith. Now, faith is an interesting topic. Let's see if you can agree. Or I won't ask. Maybe I will. Is faith a New Testament topic? Is faith mentioned in the Old Testament? How many times is the word faith used in the Old Testament, according to the King James Bible? Lots? 2 times in the entire Old Testament, the word faith is used. King James Bible. Once in Deuteronomy, which was an obscure passage, but the famous one is Habakkuk 2:4, which is quoted in Hebrews chapter 10, and Romans and Galatians. It says, the just shall live by faith. Okay? Those are the 2 references in the Old Testament where the word faith is even used. So is it a New Testament concept?
The word believe occurs in the Old Testament.
Aha! So Mike's ahead of us here. The word believe, and we've talked about belief and faith very closely. Same even root word gives us both English translations. But faith is certainly not a New Testament concept, because here in Hebrews 11 we have Old Testament individuals who were described by what? By faith. They lived out their lives by faith. We could say, correctly I believe, we could say that faith became the motivating factor in their lives. It certainly became that characteristic, as described here in Hebrews, that describes their life. Everything that they did hinged upon their belief, their faith. So we've looked at Abel, remember? This is chronological. Abel, then Enoch. Last week was Noah. Okay. Very chronological. The writer of Hebrews has them in order. Who do you suppose is next? And if you're reading, you should know who's next. Abraham. So you can say right up front, I can say without doubt, up front, no list of ancient Jewish people would be complete without Abraham. Right? What do we know about Abraham?
Father of all nations.
Okay, father of the Jewish nation, for sure, specifically. Okay, what else? Okay, back up. Where do we find him? What book? Genesis. Okay. After Noah, which was chapter 6, 7, 8, 9. Then we have, and we're going to look at these passages, we have the introduction of Abram. That's his name before. Abram. God changes it to Abraham. Okay? And we won't look at the name change too much, but we'll just mention it. But Abraham is called of God, and God establishes, and we've talked about this before, a covenant. What's a covenant? An agreement, a contract between 2 separate parties. Now in the Old Testament, we have examples. We have a covenant with Noah, which was what? God said, I will never destroy the earth again with a flood. Here's my promise, a rainbow. And in those covenants, we have conditional and unconditional, right? So, Abraham has a covenant. God intervenes. God steps into Abraham's life, calls him out, and makes a promise to him. What is it? And there's a lot of different parts to this covenant, and they're all very important. What's the first one? Okay, go to Genesis chapter 12, and we'll look at it. it's referenced here in Hebrews as well. So we need to look at it. Genesis 12, verse 1. In fact, I'll give you chapter 10, Genesis. We have the generation of the sons of Noah, which were who? Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Which line is Abraham? Shem. Which line are the Gentiles? Okay? Go to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 6. Because Hebrews 10:1 says, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the sons. These are the sons of Japheth. Verse 2. Verse 10. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his own tongue, after their families, in their nations. Where did the Gentiles come from? First time Gentile is used in the King James Bible as well. From the line of Japheth. Okay, so we're all descendants of Noah. You get down to chapter 11, verse 10. These are the generations of Shem, and it gives them all the way down there. Verse 26, Terah lived 70 years and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. There's our first reference to Abraham later. These are the generations of Terah. That's Abraham's father. Terah begat Abraham, Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity, or where he was born, the Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah, or Sarai. And the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, something like that. And the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarah was barren, she had no child. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from the Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan, and they dwelt there unto Haran, came unto Haran, and dwelt there. Okay? So if you go back into the line, Genesis chapter 10, verse 6, and the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. So that's where we get Canaan, and they're headed for the land of Canaan. Okay? The days of Terah, I'm back in chapter 11. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, verse 1, chapter 12. Now the Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, your family, from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. What's the first part of the Abrahamic covenant? He's going to give him a land. Okay? What is the description of that land? What do we call it? Okay, the land of milk and honey, as to the Exodus. What's another name we give it? The promised land. Okay? And that's an important distinction. It's going to reference that in Hebrews chapter 11 here. What's the boundaries of the promised land?
A lot bigger than it is today.
Okay? It's a lot bigger than it is today.
All the way from the Mediterranean all the way to the Tigris Euphrates.
Yep.
From Lebanon down
Had,
to the south of Egypt.
has the nation of Israel ever occupied the entire promised land? Well, under the kings David and Solomon, they were pretty close. The Davidic kingdom, the Solomon kingdom were pretty close. They occupied a large land area. But certainly today, they don't occupy that land. Has that Abrahamic covenant been rescinded? No. Is it a conditional or unconditional covenant? Unconditional. God made that promise to Abraham, which is still in effect. We're going to look at that in Hebrews chapter 11. Second part of the covenant, verse 2. And I will make of thee a great nation. Okay, what is that a promise of?
Lots of families.
descendants, okay? Children, okay? And I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. What does that refer to? Well, he will be a blessing to all nations. What's that a reference to? To the Messiah. The Messiah. Jesus is of the line of David. When we give in the New Testament, Matthew and Luke, when they give the lineage of Jesus, it goes back to Abraham. Okay? Keep that in mind. Second or third part, I guess. Verse 3, I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Reference to the Messiah. What is the covenant about blessing and cursing? Is that still in effect?
Yes.
I believe so. I don't believe God has rescinded that. Does God have a special place for the nation of Israel, the children of Israel?
Yes.
I believe so. Yes. We'll see that come to pass, come to fruition in the millennial kingdom. But that's the parts of the Abrahamic covenant. The first one deals with the land. So go to Hebrews chapter 11, because that's the first part in Hebrews that they deal with. By faith, Abraham, verse 8, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. Now we read the story of Abraham, Genesis 12 and on, and we read this verse here in Hebrews, and it's a little bit easier for us to read it and see it than it was for Abraham to hear it and do it. Physically, humanly speaking, excuse me, what God called Abraham to do made absolutely no sense. To leave everything that you know, to leave everyone that you know, and go to a different place. And the thing is he hasn't told him specifically where that place even is. This is a perfect example, and that's why it's here, a perfect example of what it means to walk by faith. Because he doesn't even know where he's going. But God's called him, and that's what I looked the two words up. Two key words in verse 8 are called and obeyed. And interesting, the word call is used a lot in New Testament passages. It means to invoke or to ask. But in here it means to call by specific name. God called Abraham by his name with a specific task. I want you to go. Now, and I read through again this week about how God spoke to Abraham. And I believe it's in the Old Testament it says God spoke to him. I believe that's what happened. God spoke to him. Now, does God speak to us today? And I know that's a loaded question, but I want us to answer. Does God speak to us today? Maybe not audibly. But does God speak to us? Very much so. Certainly. So the choice then, when God speaks to us, what do we do?
Hopefully we obey.
Hopefully we obey. But we don't always obey. And we're going to find, even on as we get through here, we're going to find even in the life of Abraham, he didn't always do exactly or trust exactly what God had told him. Okay? But in the instance when it says, get up and go, he went. Now if you look at a map, which I like maps, Chaldees is over on the Euphrates River, between the Tigris and Euphrates River, and it is almost directly east of the Promised Land. But what separates the Promised Land from the Euphrates River? Desert. Incrossable desert in this day and age. So they had to travel up. It's called the Fertile Crescent, if you remember that from your history. Mesopotamia, they traveled up the Euphrates River, up to the north, and then down along the coast, down where there was water, down to the Promised Land. Where's the first place? And we can go back to Genesis 12, and I don't believe any of this is coincidence. Genesis 12. I should have left my marker there. I knew I was coming back. Verse 4, we read through verse 3, verse 4. Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and all the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. Now how did God direct them? I don't know, and we don't know, but God gave him direction. So Abraham passed through the land unto the place of Sychem, and unto the plain of Morah, and the Canaanite was there in the land. And the Lord appeared, verse 7, unto Abram, and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel. What's Bethel mean?
House of God.
House of God. Exactly, God's house. That's the first place where Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan. God's house. The mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent. We'll come back to that. Having Bethel on the west and Hai, or whatever, on the east. There he built an altar unto the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. That's where Abram settled, in Bethel, God's house. It's interesting, as we're going to see back in Hebrews, what did Abraham live in? A tent. Now, if you are going to go conquer a land, what do you take with you? An army. Right, an army. Does Abram have an army? No. Doesn't have an army. He's not there to conquer the land. Does Abram even own any of this land? None. The only piece of land that in his lifetime, in the land of Canaan, that Abraham owns is the burial place for Sarah. He buys that piece of land so he can bury his wife. That's the only piece of land that he's going to own. But he has this confidence, faith, that God said, this is the land I'm going to give you. But he never even possesses it. He never even builds a permanent dwelling. He abides, he stays in his tents. Go back to Hebrews. By faith, he was called, he went. We saw that in Hebrew, or in Genesis. He went, God directed him, he obeyed, he listened, he acted. Verse 9, by faith he sojourned in the land of promise. What do you suppose sojourn means? Yeah, he's a stranger. He has no permanent dwelling. But God has told him, this is going to be your land. We have the saying, we're going to put down roots, right? But Abraham doesn't put down his roots. He lives there. In fact, it says, into that verse, Isaac and Jacob, his two descendants. They live there. They dwell there, but they don't own it. They don't really possess it. God's promised it to them. but they're not physically taking possession. Interesting point. Did they doubt God's promise? Even though, this is the application, a lot of time passes. They have this promise, but they're not seeing it fulfilled. Now, you and I, what happens as that time passes?
It's harder.
It gets harder to believe. Skeptic, wonder, is God really going to do this? Is He going to miraculously give us this land? He's promised it to me. I know that's going to happen. But it gets harder and harder to continue on. But it says, by faith sojourned in the land of promise as in a strange country, an alien, dwelling in tabernacles, tents, no solid dwelling place, with Isaac and Jacob, his two descendants, son and grandson, the heirs of him, with him of the same promise. So Abraham is reiterated to Isaac and both to Jacob, this is the land that God's given us. We're going to stay here. We're going to trust God that it's going to happen. But they never lived to see it. Verse 10 is an intriguing verse. I think it has great application not just for Abraham, but for us as well. For he, Abraham, looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Where's that city? Is it Jerusalem? Now stop and think. Jog your memory with me. We've already looked at Melchizedek in Hebrews, and he was, where did he live? Salem, probably Jerusalem. The city was there. The city was there. Is that what Abraham was anticipating? Okay, let's make it. You're on my thought path. That's good. Let's make it applicable. What do we wait for? Heaven? Remember what Bethel means? City of God, house of God, where God dwells. What is Abraham ultimately looking for? Well, in fact, go down. We're going to skip some middle verses here. Okay? Go to verse 13. These all died in the faith, not having received the promises. They didn't see it come to pass, but having seen them afar off. That does just because we don't see the promise fulfilled doesn't mean the promise is nullified. God made that covenant with them. He hadn't rescinded it. He hadn't taken it back. It's just the time frame is different. But having seen them afar off and were persuaded of them and embraced them, persuaded maybe should be a little stronger word. It should be convinced. Embrace them means, literally mean, when you embrace somebody, what do? You hug them. They held them close. They kept them close. They didn't forget. And confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims. Where? On the earth. We have a little chorus, which we haven't sung in ages. This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door. I can't feel at home in this world anymore. This is where their eyes were focused. What's the ultimate fulfillment of their promise?
With God.
Heaven with God. And pertinent example, application, we have to have the same focus. What keeps us moving on? The hope of heaven. The hope of being with God. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Verse 14, for they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had the opportunity to return. Can you go back? Remember, all of Hebrews is written to people, I'm sputtering today, were written to people who were contemplating going back. I'm going to go back to where I've been. And we have that opportunity. That's a choice we have. Verse 16, but now they, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, desire a better country. That is a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. It's not an earthly city. It's not Jerusalem. It's that heavenly city, that heavenly place where God dwells, that their ultimate hope resides. What keeps them moving forward? Confidence that God will do what he said he will do. Provide for them. But for 3 generations and more, they lived in the land but never possessed it. But God had promised it to them. I think one of the key points, at least is God's timetable is different than ours. And we can't, especially today, where we live in an instant world, an instant gratification, pick these. It's not how it works in our Christian life. God's, and I know the word gets overused sometimes, but God's looking for perseverance. For he's looking for us to continue on. And part of faith is trusting what God has said to be true. And living our life in the context of that. If God said it, I'm going. Abraham didn't know where. He knew specifically that God called him, and he said go, and he went. Where's he going to end up? He didn't know. I don't know about you, but I don't take too many random trips. I do that when I go hunting, when I'm out behind my house. My wife will say, where are you going to go? I said, I don't know, wherever I find a track. I said, but I can tell you this, I'm not going to get lost, and you don't have to worry about it. But when I get in the car and I'm going to take a trip, I want to know where I'm going, right? Nope. Yeah.
Been over the destination.
And I don't like Google Maps. I like the old hard map that I have in my hand. That's just old-fashioned that I am. I have an atlas in my car that says this is where I'm going to go. But to trust God to just go is hard. Yeah. Harder than most of us can imagine. Okay. But Abraham went. Go to verse 11, the verses we skipped over. These are interesting verses. Second part of the Abrahamic covenant was what? I'll make of you a great nation. Which means what? You have to have descendants. We all know the story of Abraham and Sarah. God's promised them that. You're going to be a great nation. There's only one huge problem. What?
They're old.
Well, that's what they're old and they have no kids.
Yeah, she's barren.
Okay, we read that. Sarah was barren. 2 times. Go back to Genesis. In light of that part of the covenant, Abraham's going to take matters into his own hands.
Is it Abraham or is it Sarah?
Well,
And which time?
okay, yep. Go to Genesis 15, first time. After these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abraham in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield, and thy exceeding great reward. Well, wouldn't that be great? Have God tell you that? said unto the Lord, Lord God, what wilt thou give me? Remember? Kind of like jog your memory. Seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is this Eleazar of Damascus. See what he's putting into place? Which is an accepted custom of the day. He's not inventing this up. This happens, okay? And Abraham said, verse 3, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. Eleazar is a servant, born in his household. Becomes the chief servant, chief steward, completely trusted. Even, we could say, treated like a son. Abraham has this promise. You're going to have a great nation, descendants. I don't have a child, so I'll take matters into my own hand. Here's God's response. Verse 4. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, Abram, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. Okay, and God took him abroad and said, Look toward heaven and tell me the number of the stars. Can you do that? And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. Verse 6. And he, Abram, believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. That verse is quoted in Romans chapter 4, which we're going to look at. That's the key to Abraham's life. He believed what God told him. What's the second time they take matters into their own hands? Hagar, which was the servant of Sarah, which also was an accepted custom in that day and age. Said, I don't have a child, take my handmaid. And we all know what happened there, right? What's God say to that? Not the one. But God does listen to Abram's prayer. Chapter 17, verse 20. And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee, God speaking to Abram. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful, and he will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make of him a great nation. So even though Abram got in the way of God, God's still going to bless the offspring of Abram. Okay? What did God specifically promise them? Go back to Hebrews. Through faith also, Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. So go back to Genesis, because I think this is... When God made that promise, the covenant to Abraham, chapter 12, how old was he? We read it. 75. Okay, time passes. Go to chapter 18. I got verses go down here. Chapter 17. We'll go to 17 and then we'll go to 18. Chapter 17, God changes their name. Verse 15, God said unto Abraham, As for Sarai thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name, and I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations, kings of people shall be of her. Then Abraham fell upon his face and laughed. Did he believe? And said in his heart, Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old, and shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear a child? Abraham said unto God, O that Ishmael might live before thee. When God reiterated his covenant to Abraham, Abraham laughed. Now go to verse 18, or chapter 18, which is the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they are visited, Abraham and Sarah are visited by these three angels, most likely a theophany. Abram takes them in, provides a meal for them. Verse 9, they said unto him, Where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, Behold, she's in the tent. And he, one of these angels, said, or the Christophany, I will certainly return unto thee, according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being also old? And the Lord said unto Abraham, Wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I of a surety bear a child when I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. What was their response? When God first gave the command, or the covenant, not command to them, they believed. But as the passage of time, natural age, humanly speaking, what is it? Can't happen. God reiterates that covenant with them. Both of them laugh. It's impossible. Go back to Hebrews. They give it a verse you probably read, I've read, and I've always missed it till here. Verse 12, Therefore sprang there even of one on him as good as dead. Pretty good description, huh? You're as good as dead, we use. That's how they're describing Abraham. He can't do it. He can't produce a child. Sarah cannot produce a child. Did their faith waver? Certainly. They tried to intervene for God 2 different times. God said specifically both times, that's not my plan. It's not my promise. It's not my promise. Now, I'm not saying God speaks to us again audibly, but when God speaks to us and gives us direction, what do? I know we should obey. We all know we should obey. But in actual life, does it get harder? Even miraculous? Let me ask you this. Can God still do miracles?
He's still God.
He's still God. Do we still trust Him?
We learn to.
Even when it's impossible? Did you catch that verse back and it's reiterated in the New Testament that Jesus tells the disciples, is anything too hard for the Lord? And the unequivocal answer is what? No, of course not. He's God. He's still God. Do we trust Him that far? But it's hard. And the point I'm trying to get at, these are great examples of faith that He's given to us, but they're still people. Still with doubts, still with uncertainty, still not seeing the fulfillment. They know God's promised. And sometimes I just like to see a little bit of that. Right? So I know, but God's Word is still good. It's still true. It's still the basis. and Sarah still had to learn that as time goes on. Does it always get easier? No. Is life filled with uncertainty? Every day. What do we have to hope for? There's a little verse, and it might be out of context a little bit, but that's okay, even though that's my main point. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. It says, faithful is he that calleth you, who also will do it. Who also will do it. What's God, in application, God gave specific promises to Abraham and Sarah. Now, I'm not saying you can claim those promises for yourself. That's taken it a little too far. But God's given us promises in His Word. Has He gone back on His Word? No. And it's easy, as I stated before, it's easy to teach it. It's a lot harder to live it. And that's what faith is. Abraham believed God. It was counted unto him for righteousness. Abraham's the father of the Jewish nation. What else do you know about Abraham? Go to Romans chapter 4, which is Paul's great treatise or whatever on Abraham. And the verse is quoted, verse 3 of chapter 4. For what saith the Scripture? Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. Now to him that worketh is a reward not reckoned of grace, but of debt. Okay? Do we work for our salvation? No, we believe. But to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness. Even as David also describes the blessedness of man, unto whom God imputeth righteousness without works, saying, blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven, and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. What's our main responsibility? As we looked at last week with Noah. Noah was a preacher of righteousness, but did the people respond? No. Well, they responded the wrong way. They chose not to believe. I was going to start with this and I forgot. I have it in my notes even. Which Old Testament character is mentioned the most times in the New Testament? I thought it was Abraham. And then I thought, you know what? I better look this up. It's Moses. Moses is the most referenced Old Testament character in the New Testament. Abraham is second. Who's the third? David. David. Oh, King David. The king. David the king. Yeah, as referenced here in Romans chapter 4. David. Those are the three Old Testament characters referenced most times in the New Testament. Moses, Abraham, and David. That's just a tidbit. But we're going to look a lot about Moses in chapter 11. There's a lot more about Abraham. The greatest test that Abraham had was what? Sacrifice his son. Something he has waited literally his entire life. And God calls him specifically, and I can't look at all of it today, I only got 5 minutes. but it's the dearest, most precious thing to his heart. Something he's waited his entire life for. And God calls him specifically, says, take thy son Isaac, thine only son, and take him up and offer him as a sacrifice unto me. And what's he do? He obeys. What would you do? I know what I would have done. I'd have bargained and pleaded. Anything but that. Right? And Abraham obeyed. And that's really our lesson for next time. Starts in verse 17. By faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And he that received the promises offered up his only begotten son. His whole future, his whole life was wrapped up in that son. And God said, I want him. So the application, and I'll come back to it. And it's interesting. God wants what you hold